And I started the recording now. And another reminder that there's the questions area, and we can monitor that during the session here. So if you have a question about anything I'm saying, you want to ask something for clarification, anything like that, you can go ahead and enter that, and we'll do our best to answer those questions, some of which we'll be able to do in the moment, some of which we might need to get back to you. As you know, the field with APPR and the state of New York is kind of in flux. Things are changing. So some of this is we have the plan set and everything we understand, and then some of it is kind of subject to change as things evolve. So I'll start with the topics for today. So first thing we're going to do after this slide is some introductions. Then we're going to talk about the continuing 3012C compliant option for the folks that have used education analytics or VARC analytics in the past. I'll say it right away, is that we're going to continue to produce the 3012C options for any districts that have gotten a hardship waiver and they need to continue on with what they've been getting from our team in the past. We'll be continuing to do the value added and the CGI model options, and I'll go into a little bit more detail as a refresher about what those are. Then we will talk about the new joint NWEA and Education Analytics 3012D approved options. So we have two different methodologies that have been approved by the state for use in 3012D districts. We have a growth model and we have a student learning objectives model. I'll talk about both of those. Then we'll get into a little bit of logistics for obtaining results. This will be familiar for the folks that have used our service in the past, and I do recognize a number of names here for folks that have been previous users of education analytics metrics. And then we'll have probably quite a bit of question and answer time at the end in case you have anything that you'd like to save to the end. But along the way, certainly do ask questions verbally by unmuting yourself if you've chosen to have that control, or go ahead and type in the question box. There'll be several slides along the way where I'm going to be pausing for questions after each of these larger bullet points. And then, of course, at the end, there's more time. Introduction. So we have two organizations working together to provide options for using MAP assessment in APPR plans. Education Analytics, or EA, we're the organization creating a state-approved growth model and student learning objective approach for APPR using the MAP assessment. Any questions about the use of MAP for APPR, specifics of the newly developed and newly approved 3012D APPR approaches, or for the approaches EA has used for select New York districts in the past for 3012C, should be directed at our team at Education Analytics. We also have Northwest Evaluation Association, NWEA. That's the organization that created the MAP assessment and is working with districts to implement MAP. Any questions related to MAP itself should be directed at NWEA. So today on the call we have myself, Sean McLaughlin, Director of Operations at Education Analytics, and then with me I also have Joe, and maybe you can just say hi, Joe, and they can hear your voice.
Hello.
All right, that's Joe. So Joe's been doing a lot of the number crunching here in past years, and then he's also been responsible for some of the preliminary kind of preview looks that we'll be showing you today and about how the 3012D metrics are working so far in the way that the state has approved our proposed plans. And then also on the call we have NWEA's representative Amanda Towerman. She's here for any questions we may get along the way or at the end. So first of all, of course I recognize a few of the names that are on the list here today of attendees, and you know who Education Analytics is. But for anybody that doesn't know, we are a nonprofit organization. We're located in Madison, Wisconsin. And then Dr. Robert H. Meyer is our founder and president here at Education Analytics. He wears a few different hats. He's also the research professor at UW-Madison, and he's a professor at the La Follette School of Public Affairs here in Madison as well. On the right side of the screen, I have our website, and I don't think you can click that right there, but if you were to type that in, you'd get to our website. And we'll be following up a little bit after the webinar with some links, and that should give you a more straight shot at getting to our website. But that is where you can learn more about us. And for some more background, here are a selection of places that our team has worked on student growth models. This includes SLO work, it includes SGP work, it includes value-added work, it includes kind of customized homegrown growth metrics. So we have a lot of experience working across the country on different growth metrics and being compliant in different federal and state regulations to make sure that we get a model that works for stakeholder type priorities as well as being compliant with the state's metrics. So that's what we're trying to do here in making sure that we get a growth model that works for you in our 3012C or 3012D. First of all, I'm going to talk about the continuing 3012C options, and several of you may be interested in hearing that we're going to be continuing to do this. So why are we doing this? Why are we talking about it? So most of the 50 districts we've worked with in the past may continue using the 3012C measures due to these hardship waivers that we've been hearing folks are applying for. So if you're in a district that in the past couple of years has used the value-added scores that Education Analytics or VARC Analytics has produced in the past, that's something that is going to continue to be provided for us. So we wanted to let you know about that. Another reason to talk about 3012C is that it's good background on EA's co-build approach to growth measures. So a little bit earlier, I alluded to the fact that we are working with stakeholders to think about how to make a customized growth metric that works for everybody. We'll be showing you how we worked out the 3012C metric to kind of give a window into how we're thinking of approaching 3012D as well, and a lot of the parallels that we've used to make the decisions in the 3012D metrics. Also some background on EA's use of MAP and SIRS data. I'll go into more detail here a little bit later. We use data from a few different sources in order to produce the metrics that we've been providing so far. So that allows us to have higher quality metrics, but it also has some implications that there's some extra steps that you or your RIC or the state may be able to help us with to collect those extra data files. And it's important to realize the different sources of data so we can kind of prevent some confusion that we have had in the past in certain projects about where the data comes from and why certain things are or aren't used. And then finally, the approved growth metric that the state has recently approved from 3012D will be very similar to our 3012C approach. And in particular, the growth metric for 3012D will be very similar to the value-added model that was produced by Education Analytics in the past for 3012C. And just a note here too is that some of the details of implementation are still pending. All right, and here's a view here. How is EA's 3012C metric determined? It was co-developed with an advisory council that included representatives from participating New York school districts, NYSED, NYSET, Education Analytics, our team, and then we also had representatives from NWEA there. And we all worked together to determine what were the decision points going to be for how we use data to come up with a growth metric. And it may even be the case that some of you can recognize yourselves in these photos. So we've been working together as a team over the years to make sure that we got a good growth metric for everybody. Moving forward, NWEA and EA will continue to solicit feedback and direction from the Advisory Council and other New York districts, and will make adjustments to our current recommendations as needed. So to start off, again, this is 3012C I'm talking about for now, and then we'll work on 3012D next. But this is kind of background and indications of what anybody that had a hardship waiver that's used EA in the past will be receiving. So two growth models. We had the value-added metric. That's a measure of the contribution of educators to student growth. It compares the growth of your students to similar students, including a number of demographic factors such as those listed there in that. That's not exhaustive. That's just a start to give you an idea of what we adjust for. There's also the Conditional Growth Index, or CGI. That's an additional growth model for districts that desire two different ways to use MAP for 3012C. There was a locally selected measure and then a comparable measure, and sometimes there were different names for those. Folks wanted two different ways to use MAP. And what that does is it aggregates NWEA's Conditional Growth Index metric, and we use the same sort of data that we've determined about which students and teachers are linked together. We've aggregated that and provided that in the past. For now, today, we're going to be focusing on the 3012C value added, because that's the most similar of these two metrics to the 3012D approved option. And then we'll talk about the student learning objectives approach as well. This is a view of one of the pages on our website, and the URL is at the top again. And again, not clickable, but we'll send out a link a little bit later so you can go ahead and click on that and look around a little bit. Why might you want to come to this website? We have descriptions of how our 3012C metrics work. We have some explanation of how we use the SIRS data, the Student Information Repository System data that your districts submit to either BOCES or RICs that go to the state. We use that. It also has some resources for different audiences, some sample result files, and then a timeline of events. And I'll say it right now, the 3012D timeline details are still pending. So we don't have all the answers for you right now about when all the milestones are going to be, but we're working closely with NWEA to figure out what's going to make sense. Some of those are related to the decisions of where we're going to be receiving the SIRS data. Those have implications for what the timelines are going to be. So as that continues to evolve, we'll get you as much information as we can to make sure that you can prepare for however you might choose to use our services. This is kind of a preview, or you could actually go there whenever you want. It's available now. There are a couple introductory videos for 3012C. So unfortunately for everybody involved, perhaps, things keep changing. So these are a little bit out of date now that the 3012D kind of change has taken place. But this would be good background for anybody that wants to learn more about how our metrics have worked in the past. And there's going to be many similarities to how EA's 3012D approved growth model approach works compared to what you can see in these videos. So there's a few changes, notably the translation to 0 to 20 has changed quite a bit, but the general methodology has remained the same. This does not get into the SLO piece. That's completely different, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later on today, but these videos won't give you insight into that. So what I thought I'd do next is take just a few slides, and for anybody that's seen the oak tree before, you can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm not going to do the oak tree thing again today, but if anybody is interested in seeing that again or doesn't know what I'm talking about and want to check it out, it's on these two videos that we have on the website. That's kind of a good background for anybody that wants to start from just tell me the basics and work from there. We have that available. So not the oak tree, but a little bit more explanation here. How is my MAP value-added APPR score determined? And this is 3012C again. I think I sound a little bit like a broken record, but there's so many things going on. I want to be super explicit. So this is 3012C I'm talking about with some parallels to 3012D. And by the way, I had quite a bit of coffee this morning because it's a little bit early in the day here. So if anybody in the question box can let me know, am I talking too fast or not? Depending on where I'm talking to across the country, people are telling me I'm talking too fast. But I found that in New York, people can kind of generally be on the same pace with speaking. So I'll keep going. All right, good. So we're good according to a couple people here. So step one. After spring testing is complete, EA collects student data from participating districts across New York, and EA determines demographic and other adjustments. So we're collecting data from across the state, and then we're figuring out how we're going to make these adjustments. Second step is each student, so Jimmy, Susan, Bobby, each student gets a customized statistical prediction based on his or her characteristics. So we look at that fall score, and again, we're thinking 14, 15. So there's a student at the beginning in the fall, we have a test score for them. And then we look at all these different adjustments we've determined from across the state. So things that we look about average growth for similar kids with starting point. We think about the test window. When did the kid take the test? What month of the year? And a bunch of other demographic adjustment, things like gender, race, ethnicity, ELL status, free reduced price lunch status, special education status. All those things might have an impact on how students might grow, not due directly to something that the educators are doing themselves. So that's why we're trying to adjust for these different things to try to get an apples to apples comparison of how students are growing. So we get those predicted scores for how students would grow compared with how similar students grew from across the state with similar characteristics. Next, we determine if each student actual score exceeded or did not meet that prediction and by how much. So here on the left, we have an example of a student whose actual score was higher than the predicted score. That student exceeded their prediction by, let's say, 5 points. And then here's a different student that had a different customized predicted score. Their actual score was lower, so that student did not meet prediction by 4 points. So here this idea is that each student either met, exceeded, or did not meet their prediction, and then we also take into account by how much. Then we want to know, on average, did a teacher's student tend to exceed or not meet their predictions, and by how much? And that is the value each teacher added to the student's growth. So that's where that goofy term value added comes from. So on the left, teacher A, we have, if we average all those arrows together, we get that those students grew a little bit faster than average, about 3 RIT points faster than similar students across the state. That would lead to an above average value added result. And then teacher B, it turns out their student did not meet predictions by a little under 1 point. So that would mean that that teacher would get a below average value added. Then kind of the $1 million question here is, how do we go to 0 to 20? Because that's the number that we need for APPR. So what we do is value added results are converted to 0 to 20 using the New York Advisory Council's default translation. And there, we'll show that in a little bit about how exactly that works, but we average all those kids together and find out on average how much did they beat or not meet their predictions. And then there's a translation that puts folks on this 0 to 20 range. And the guidelines here that I've shown on the screen, these are the 3012C ones. And just to get a sense of it, let's say Miss Johnson here, her students didn't do very well compared with similar kids. Miss Johnson's kids all did not meet their predictions, and actually by quite a large margin here. So that's going to lead to a pretty low rating on the 0 to 20 scale. On the other end of the spectrum, Miss Smith, her students did really well compared with similar kids from across, and I keep saying the state, but I should really be saying districts that are participating with our services, because we only collect the SERS data from districts that are participated with us. So Miss Smith here, her students did really well. She would get a score really high in the 0 to 20 range. I've talked a few times about these two sources of data. I'll go into that a little bit here. One source of data is the NWEA MAP test data. We get the fall and spring test scores from NWEA directly after you've signed a waiver saying that you can go ahead and give your data to, NWEA can disclose your data to Education Analytics. We also collect the CGI scores for anybody that needs those CGI metrics in addition to value added. A note here that we're not using the NWEA class roster files in any way. So we are not using those CRF files to determine which students were taught by which teachers. And why aren't we doing this? And this is a decision we've made several years ago, and we've stuck with it for reasons that NWEA's class roster files are not designed for this purpose of figuring out growth metrics for accountability purposes. They're not filled out in an entirely consistent way. We understand that this is a way for teachers and other educators to get views into students and seeing how they're doing. It's not meaning that actually every teacher in those roster files is responsible for instruction, which is really important when we're trying to do accountability-based growth metric type things. And it's not as detailed about student-teacher relationships as SERS data. SERS data is really rich in that it shows us things like instructional responsibility weight, it shows us team teaching and co-teaching in certain ways, it shows us mobility, it shows us minutes of instruction. It has a lot of interesting stuff that we're taking into account in our growth metrics. So I alluded to this, but yes, we're using SERS data, and that's Student Information Repository System data. We look at the math and reading course identification. There's certain course codes, and specifically if it's a 4-digit code, if it starts with a 1 or a 2, we count those as math and reading courses. Or if it's a 5-digit code, if the second digit is 1 or 2, we count those as math or reading courses. So that's how we determine which courses are aligned to math or reading instruction. It also lets us know which are the teachers of those courses. So we look in there and there's a row for every student and each of the teachers that they've had in those courses. So we go ahead and capture that to understand which teachers taught students. We look at the instructional responsibility. There are flags in there to let us know that a teacher should not be held responsible for instruction, or it's partially responsible for instruction. We go ahead and look at that to determine which links make sense to use for our metrics. It's also the source of our demographic and program participation for students. Program participation meaning things like free reduced price lunch program, those sort of things. That's how we collect those. And there's a link there at the bottom that lets you know where you might learn more about SERS data, and then specifically how we use that is a different source. So I'll show you that. And here's just one example slide from our FAQ in the materials that are up on our website right now about which students am I linked to, just kind of a little bit of deeper dive here. So we receive your district student information repository system data to determine which teachers taught courses designated math or reading, ELA, based on the state course code. So here in this little visual, we have a teacher that's linked to a course that had a certain course code like the ones that I've mentioned earlier. Then we look at which students were enrolled in those courses and for how long. So we take into account if a student was there all throughout the year or only part of the year. So we make adjustments for that to try to be fair to educators that have mobile students, or fair to teachers who the teachers are mobile and they have different students throughout the year, courses for semesters, those sort of things. Again, just kind of hitting it home again, the class roster files are not used for this analysis. So how exactly does EA use SIRS data? If you're interested in learning more, the rules were established in collaboration with the New York Advisory Council. And if you want to learn about the specific rules, you can find them in the handbook that's downloadable from EA's website that I talked about a little bit earlier. So if you go ahead and look at the who's eligible part of the page, you can go ahead and download our handbook. It's pretty dense. It has a lot of rules if you want to dig down to think about how did we determine which course codes, how were we thinking about different start and end dates for kids, those sort of things. So I'm going to go ahead and pause now since I've been talking at you for quite a while. That's how much I wanted to go into 3012C, and I'll be going into 3012D next. But I'm going to pause now in case anybody wanted to type in any questions or unmute yourself, or ask me to unmute you in case you've elected earlier to have me go ahead and mute you on my end. So let's see, I'm not sure if this is intentional or not, but I see one hand raised. So I'm going to unmute Darla Thomas. Did you have a question? And I'm sorry, I'm just seeing now that this was from 35 minutes ago.
No, I don't have a question. I just joined a little bit late.
Okay, excellent. And we started the recording right at the beginning. We'll have that available for you so you can check out that first part of it. So any other questions or comments? All right, I'm going to go ahead and proceed. And if you're still typing, go ahead and enter as soon as you're done, and I'll take a look at any questions that come up. So the first thing I'm going to do here is highlight the changes from 3012C to 3012D from our perspective and our metrics that we'll be providing. So at a high level, the state now improves combined approaches for the assessment and a growth metric together. So NWEA and EA submitted a joint proposal, and those have been approved for a growth metric and an SLO option. In the past, there was a list of approved assessments, and then districts could kind of choose whatever it is that they wanted to do with them. But our understanding of the current way that things are working now in 3012D for districts that are into that law, the approach has to be this combined one. So vendors such as NWEA who are providing tests, they're providing a growth metric with it as well. And in our cases, NWEA has chosen to use Education Analytics as the vendor, the provider of the growth metrics for growth model and SLO here. So there's two different options here, the growth model, which is very similar to what we just talked about, and now student learning objectives, a new one that I'll be describing in greater detail shortly. Another highlighted change here is that there are new 0 to 20 APPR cut points. You may have seen that already, and we'll be going into greater detail about what that is and how our jointly approved option kind of deals with the fact that that changed and doesn't produce any kind of unintended high amounts of ineffective ratings. So we've thought about that closely, and we'll show you how we're proposing to address that. Also, we've worked with NWEA to determine that the language usage assessment is something that's on the approved list, and we will be providing metrics for that as well. Previously, we've only been doing math and reading. So in the future, starting this summer, we'll also be providing language usage results for folks that are using 3012D. Now I'm going to talk about the growth model approach. So there's growth model and there's SLO, growth model first. There's some similarities to the 3012C metric the value-added results specifically that I described earlier. What are these similarities? We're going to be using SIRS data for rosters and course identification. We're going to be making adjustments for student demographic characteristics. We are going to take into account the average effect of educators on student growth. We take into account the degree to which students grew faster or slower than peers, and this list could go on and on and on. We've really taken the decisions and the feedback that we've gotten from stakeholder districts under 3012C to think about how we want to make 3012D work. So the vast majority of decisions are going to be the same from what we've seen in the past with that metric. The differences are mainly the new 0 to 20 translation, and those are requirements that are changed in the new regulation. So we have a preview of what that's going to look like. It's just draft, but just to give you a sense of, we've tried to keep things mostly the same in the way that Heidi turns out. And then the inclusion of the language usage assessment that I just mentioned earlier. So those are the main differences. I'll talk a little bit about the 0 to 20 scale change. So here's the 3012C scale, 0 to 20. We have 0 to 2 being ineffective, and you can see the other parts as well here. 3012D, what happened? So now 0 to 12 is ineffective, and the others are kind of all compressed here. Highly effective kept the same, but the effective and the developing band have really tightened up a ton when it comes to this 0 to 20 scale. So what we did in 3012C with feedback from the advisory council was the idea that the average teacher in our sample of districts, it makes sense for the average teacher to get a rating of effective and to be kind of in the middle there. So the way that we did this is we gave the average teacher a 13. And in the new 0 to 20, we decided that to keep the spirit of that decision, we should put the average teacher in the middle of effective again, and now in this case it's 16. So in our proposal to the state, we had to give a translation scale here, and on the left is 3012C, on the right is 3012D, and for anybody that loves z-scores, you can see that we've changed these in an attempt to get the kind of the same mentality of very few teachers in the ineffective category in I, and the average teacher goes in the middle of the effective range. And this is kind of the z-scores here. And now I'll show you one more thing, and then I'll look for questions here. So on the left here we have the distribution of the 2014-15 results under the 3012C law. This is showing you basically most of the teachers here, 84%, ended up in the effective range. And now under 3012D, despite the fact that the ineffective range is so many numbers on the scale, we've built our system so that essentially a very similar thing happens. And I wouldn't get hung up too much on exactly what these percentages are right now, because this is just a very early draft using the rules of how things have translated, but it's just kind of to step back and see things are not going to change wildly based on the new 3012D cut point scale. We've tried under the regulations and the way that things are set up to get a pretty similar outcome under 3012D for anybody that chooses the growth metric. So I'm going to go ahead and look here for questions here. So I hear a question here: what is the statistical or evidence-based rationale for assuming the average teacher is effective? So that's a great question, and that is something that we've discussed at length with the advisory council. So I'll attempt to kind of give justice to a few points, but there may be some more things that I'll be leaving out here. So in growth metrics, you kind of have to make things relative. It's harder to make more of a criterion of reference or an absolute determination of how much growth is enough. So almost always growth metrics are kind of this relative nature. And to that end, we had a discussion with the advisory council about what would it make sense for the teaching force, and what would it make sense for the average teacher to be in these categorical rating labels, because as researchers and folks that look at data, we can tell you certain things that relate to how did one teacher or one school perform compared to another by making adjustments. But the decision of what that label should be is a policy decision and has implications for how people think about the outcomes. There's social implications, there's political implications, there's a bunch of implications that have to do with policy. So we talked through with some stakeholders that included that list of folks that I had earlier in the presentation, and the jointly determined idea was looking at the spirit of 3012C in that it had to be possible for teachers to get any of the 0 to 20 ratings, but also there were these certain value judgments placed on these different categories that the determination was made that the average teacher should be middle of the effective range. So I'm not sure if I really gave you a meaty answer there, but the advisory council was the jointly determined decision of how that was going to work. Let's see, and then the rationale for setting a similar idea from 3012C and 3012D. There were a couple things that led us to this decision, one of which was the regulations from the state's requirements under 3012D, where we had to create a close approximation of the distribution of scores that the state of New York has produced under their statewide SGP system. That was one thing. And the second thing was that we wanted to honor the conversations we've had with stakeholders in the past about how they thought a growth metric was going to work. So those were the two things that we had in our minds as we were coming up with the new translation to 3012D. So we've come up with one that's been approved preliminarily for this year, and we're going to continue on with that, at least for this first year. But we're also interested in getting feedback from folks in case we need to come together and think about how we might need to change it in the future. So we're still open to feedback on that, but this is a kind of a quick turnaround thing in that the state had certain timelines and they needed something from us so that folks could get that into their plans. So we did our best to try to meet those criteria, but we're very interested in continuing our co-build process in the future. So I'll continue to look at questions here. Okay, I'll look at the z-scores for just a bit here. Let's see. So z-scores are a way of describing how did a certain, in this case, value-added results compare to others. And let's see. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse pointer, but if you can, I'm attempting to look at the left side on 3012C, kind of in the middle here, at the range of negative 0.1 to positive 0.1. In the middle of that would be 0. And what a z-score of 0 means is that your students grew on average exactly the same as typical for similar students across our districts. So a z-score of 0 would mean your students were exactly average in how they grew, which would mean we would claim is that the teacher had an average effect on the growth of those kids. So that's what we mean when we say an average teacher. Positive z-scores that are getting higher and higher mean that those students on average grew faster, and the bigger the number, the faster they grew compared to similar students. So higher z-scores mean the students grew faster, and then lower z-scores mean the students grew slower. And let's see, just to give you a sense of this, somewhere between approximately +1 and -1, and there's a little bit more complication here because we do some things for small sample size corrections, but just as kind of like a guideline here, between -1 and +1 are approximately 68% of the results would fall in that range. And Joe is kind of nodding at me that I've got that at least approximately right. So it's a way of describing did students grow faster or slower and by how much. And 3012D, the same idea of how you interpret z-scores applies, but we've changed the range here so that 0 here is in the effective category again instead of down here in the 3012C thing. Okay, I think I've more or less looked at the questions that have come up so far. If there's any follow-ups, please do type some more in. I'll do my best to wade my way through them and get you the information that you need. So let's see, let's move on to SLO. So far we've just talked about the value added or the growth metric, and I'm using those interchangeably because the 3012D growth model that we had approved by the state is a value added model to keep in the same ideas that we got from the advisory council on our co-build value added model under 3012C. So in this slide, what I'm doing here is letting you know of the two options here that we have, the growth model and the SLO option for 3012D, why, like, they're different. What's different about them? We're going to kind of break that down here first. So under the growth model, we are comparing the growth of a student to the growth of similar students, and we account for a bunch of stuff, including the starting point of students, demographic characteristics, and a bunch of other stuff. In the SLO approved plan, we have a predefined target as the target by which students are compared. And I'll talk about what that target is shortly. The growth model takes into account the degree to which a student met or did not meet typical growth. So before I had those arrows, and it mattered if it was a big arrow or a small arrow in terms of did a student meet or exceed their target. In the SLO option, it's just a yes or no. Did the student meet it? Did they not meet it? And we don't take into account by how much. The 0 to 20 APPR translation in the growth model is based on the average effect of the educator on student academic growth. So we try to average all the students together to see what was the average effect of the educator on those students. And in the SLO option, what we do, because of the way the state has set this up, is that the SLO is based on a percentage of students that meet a growth target. So it's about percentages rather than average effect. For visual people like me, I'm going to show it a different way. So the growth model on the left, this is similar to what we saw in the past. We create a predicted score for students, kind of an apples to apples. And when I say that, I mean all those demographic adjustments, test window adjustments, all those different things that we do to try to make as best a prediction of how similar students did. Then we look at the actual score and determine did the student beat or not meet that prediction and by how much. In contrast with SLO, what we do is there is a predefined growth target that you get at the beginning of the year. The growth model, just to be crystal clear, despite the fact that we call this a predicted score on the left here, you don't get that at the beginning of the year because of a number of reasons. Foremost being we need to collect all that data from across districts in the state to determine how students like yours across the participating districts tended to grow that particular year. So because we make all those adjustments, it's a higher burden to collect data files and analyze all that to determine how much average growth was. So one difference here is those targets in the SLO option, they come earlier to you. We see if the actual score of the student was higher or lower than that, and then we just say like met or not met here, and then it doesn't take into account by how much. Then we have to aggregate that into a score of some kind. So on the left on our growth model, it's the same thing we saw earlier. We average together all those arrows. So we find out what was the average effect, and in this case it was about 3 RIT points faster than average. In the SLO on the right, what we do is each student either gets a met or not met based on that target, and then we find out the percentage that was met, and that's how we get to that percentage. So what's the target in the SLO approach? This kind of the blue target thing in the visual. So our approved plan uses the national growth norms, and the standard error of growth is considered when determining whether a student met the target. So if you were to want to talk about what is the growth target for a student, you could continue those conversations that you may have had with teachers and educators already, that a good target for students is the national growth norm. However, when we looked at the way that the system has been set up and the 0 to 20 translation, we determined jointly with NWEA that a good option here for fairness under HIDE, under APPR, would be to consider the standard error of growth when determining the student, the target, and whether the student met the target. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail here. So why are we doing that? Here, the average teacher in across the country, and also we think within this sample, typically meets somewhere between 50, 55, something in that range, maybe even 60, something in that range of how many of their students met the national norm, the national growth target for their students. So if you look at the way the state has mandated the 0 to 20 translation happen in the SLO option, that would lead to the average teacher getting a rating in the ineffective range. So the average teacher would get an I. So we didn't think that's what folks wanted. So we thought about how can we make the 0 to 20 translation still work, still get at the spirit of a year of growth, which is also in the language, and not have that final outcome of everybody gets an I happen. So what did we do? We determined that if we think about the growth target being the growth norm, but also take into account when we're determining if each individual student met or not, we think about the standard error, then we get something that's more in line with what we've seen before of what the general policy implications were that folks wanted. So we did some preliminary analysis, and again, I'll stress the word preliminary here to show you what we looked at to determine that this was a good idea. So here's the if you were to go out right now and try to make the growth norms be your target for your kids, and then translate that using the state's 0 to 20, 30, 12D cut points, this is what you might expect to see. And this is all the districts that we've worked with last year. We put their data in and crunched it and saw preliminarily this is what this would look like. And we thought this is probably not a good idea. So what we did is we thought about what are some options that we could use to adjust this. And if we were to take into account the standard error of measure around the results for students, when we're determining if a student met or did not meet, this is the distribution that we see, which we thought was a good compromise here of meeting the state's letter of the law, but also thinking about how can we make this get to our policy outcomes that we heard from the advisory council in the past. So again, this is preliminary. I should have a huge preliminary stamp here, but that's kind of the expected translation that you might see on the SLO option. So I'm going to pause here about any questions you might have about the SLO option and how that might work. All right, I'm going to go into logistics then. And again, some of this we know, some of it is still a little bit in the planning phases. So the first thing that we think is going to happen coming up is there's going to be a sign-up phase, and NWEA is going to be distributing a survey to all their partners to get a sense of who wants what. Districts have a lot of, well, several options from what we understand. Some districts are still in negotiations about what they want to do in their districts, so you may or may not know exactly what you want when you get the survey, and that's okay. We built it with some ways for you to look at telling us you need more time, or we can follow up with you. Some districts are trying to get or have gotten perhaps hardship waivers to use the 3012C metrics in the past. Whether or not you used EA before is important then for us to know, and to hear if you got 3012C, or if you're producing 3012D plans, then we want to know, do you want to use MAP for that? And then if so, EA would be then providing you with both the growth model and the SLO option, so you can choose which one you want to use there. So that'll be first. Also, what we're going to be doing is working to collect the SIRS data and the MAP test scores. So from the SIRS data, we're hoping we can leverage some of the relationships we've built in the past with the RICs, or maybe even potentially we could get some help from the state to collect SIRS data to make a lighter lift for everybody involved. Potentially we would also come to districts if we weren't able to get your data from RICS or the state. So that's kind of one of the driving forces of decisions here and how the timeline is going to work. So we'll be collecting CSRS data there. Also, NWEA is going to be providing MAP test scores if you are to release those by signing a way that Education Analytics can use those for the purposes of producing these metrics. There's also expected teachers templates, and I'll talk about that shortly. That is a way for your district to tell us for which teachers you're expecting to receive results, so we make sure we get good coverage for you. Then we'll be producing preliminary results. Historically, this has been produced in late July. Those will be hosted via secure site, and the purpose of that is to give your district a time period to look at it, and what we're calling that typically is this embargo period. From late July to early August is how it's been in the past. That lets you tell us, are there any gaps in coverage? Is there anything that we need to investigate before we make our final results run? This is important because, as we mentioned earlier, the way that these growth models work, we need to determine how average growth was for students that are like yours across the different districts. So we want to make sure we get everybody's data as best we can and get all things corrected, because not only does it affect you, it affects everybody. We all want to have the highest data quality we can. Then we produce our final results. Historically, this happens in mid-August, and we know that doesn't give you a whole lot of time to then turn that around for district dissemination internally and also to the state. That is being driven by this data collection and embargo period on all these things that we've built up so far. So unfortunately, it is pretty late in the year in the timeline, but that's how we've been producing it in the past, and why paying attention and looking during the embargo period is so important. Expected teachers templates that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and this is just a tiny screenshot on the right just to give you a sense of it in case you looked at one in the past. I know, like, I'd be amazed if anybody can read all that. So we have better examples up on our website, but this is a way for your team to tell Education Analytics which teachers should be getting results in your district. It's a way for us to help with quality control. We would send back diagnostic files in the preliminary results that look at this expected teachers list so we can help jointly track down issues that may be occurring. Things like the course codes might be coded incorrectly, or other things that might be going wrong. We can help to diagnose those and solve those. The templates will be sent out to districts for completion in the spring. Results files, again, this kind of a really rough preview here of what we've produced in the past. One row per teacher. It's a spreadsheet. It shows you the number of students. It shows you the results 0 to 20. We'll be delivering these via our secure portal. There'll be one file type, one file per result type. So if you got an SLO option and a growth model option for us at the teacher level, you'd get two different files there. So we can label them, and you can make sure you're opening the right one. And they're distributed to educators and states by you. We do not distribute any of these results besides just to our district contact at your district. For anybody that's doing 3012C and has used Education Analytics in the past, there have been two options. One is the standard result type. That is teacher level results for value added. There was also a number of districts that wanted school level metrics and this other CGI type metrics, so that would be the deluxe results type. For anybody that might be using 3012C, the survey that we'd be sending out would let you designate whether you were interested in receiving the standard or the deluxe results for 3012C. In 3012D, we have a growth model option and an SLO option, and rather than continue on with the complexity there, that there were different options, we just made one option. So everybody that decides to use us for 3012D will get the growth model and the SLO, all of that. So you'll just have that in your hands, and that means that you'll have more options about how you choose to use those, and kind of less decisions to make up front about exactly how you're going to decide which one to elect to receive. A note here that at the teacher level, so these ones that have the asterisks, we are only going to continue to produce teacher level metrics for teachers who teach students in grades K through 10 in mathematics, reading, or language usage according to the SERS state course code. So just a heads up there that we're going to continue on with the decision of the advisory council there to only be producing teacher level metrics for teachers that actually, according to the state course codes, teach in those content areas. Another note here is that the CGI metric is not a state approved method for 3012D. Timeline. So here's this big red-orange sort of text here. This is a sample from last year. We do not have the timeline yet for you for 2016. It may be similar to this though, however, which is why I just have it up here in case you wanted to just get a sense of it. So we'll be producing the metrics likely in mid to late August again, and we'll be getting you more information as we learn more, particularly about SERS data collection, as that will probably have the largest impact on how things are going to work. So now we're going to start the question and answer session. And while you're thinking about anything you might want to ask, we have an idea here just to refresh you some of the things that we talked about today. If you have any questions about those topic area ideas, also contact Education Analytics. That's our email for this particular project, NewYorkAPPR@edanalytics.org. That's how you can contact us with any questions about how MAP is used with APPR, either in 3012C, 3012D, or any other questions you might have about that. And a note that you'll see a survey soon. I'll say soon lightly because we still have to work out exactly which questions are the right ones to make sure we get all the information that we need from you. You'll see that survey that will let you know, or excuse me, let us know what your plans are for APPR so we can make sure that we meet your needs. So I'm gonna leave the recording on for just a little bit and get any questions that you might want to ask during the recording, and then I'll shut the recording down. I'll stay on a little bit longer and answer any questions you might have. The PowerPoint we'll send that out to everybody after the webinar. It may take us just a couple days to make sure we get that all set up, but we'll send that out to the registration list for this webinar. You'll have that available, and then this recording we'll have up on the website in case anybody wants to listen to the narration again, or you want to send it to any colleagues so they can hear it. So I will be quiet right now. If you want to unmute yourself, or you can, in the question box, even ask me to unmute you in case you want to ask something verbally, I can go ahead and do that. So I will pause now. As people may be typing, in case anybody else has another appointment they want to get to, just wanted to let you know that's all the content I wanted to deliver today. So thank you all for getting up early and joining us for this webinar, learning about APPR and our options that we have with Education Analytics and NWEA. And I'll stay on for any questions, but thank you all for joining, and I'm going to end up stopping the recording.